concluding section of our Wednesday evening Bible study for the fall. We started back in September and have gone now for 10 Wednesday nights, and I want to thank those of you who have come so faithfully. I see Lynn Montgomery, our Director of Food Service over here. I would like to thank her for the good meals that she has provided. I'd like to thank the many volunteers of you who help serve the meal, who help clean up after it's all over. As you well know, this kind of enterprise takes lots of people, and much gratitude to each of you who've had a hand in what we've been doing. Let me say some words about some things that are going to be happening in the future on Wednesday. Next Wednesday night will be Thanksgiving Eve, and we're going to have a choral Eucharist at 6:30 in the church that will offer Eucharist for the holiday season. That'll be at 6:30, same time as this next Wednesday. The following day, which is Thanksgiving Day itself, St. Luke's will also participate with the other churches in Mountain Brook. We have what's called the Shades Valley Ministerial Association, and each year all of these churches go together to have a cooperative Thanksgiving service. This is essentially a preaching and a praise service, and it's going to be held at the Roman Catholic Church, St. Francis Xavier, right across from the Montclair Hospital. And the new Roman Catholic Bishop for Alabama is going to be, as the priest says, our homilist. He's going to give the sermon that day. He's a wonderful Irishman. I have met him. Got lots of good humor, got lots of good spirit. And that'll be at 10 o'clock on Thanksgiving morning. I know that may not work with everybody's schedules, but those are the two things that we're going to do next week, because that is Thanksgiving week. Let me announce that we will begin these suppers and studies on January the 11th. That'll be the second Wednesday into January, and Rondell Bain is going to do a 4-part series beginning on January the 11th, in which his focus is going to be Jesus renewing the face of the earth. It will be a 4-part study at the whole issue of renewal to get us up to Ash Wednesday, which will be February the 8th, and then we'll move into the Lenten season. But I did want to tell you what lies ahead as I thank you for as we look back. One word to our St. Luke's parishioners. I want to thank you for your prompt and good response to our stewardship effort. As of this evening, we've gotten in 352 cards pledging $655,000. That's $115,000 under where we got at the end of our campaign last time. We were well ahead at this point in the number of cards and in the kind of support that is being pledged. So I think we have every reason to be optimistic. I thank each of you who have already made your commitment, and invite anyone who hasn't had that chance to do it so we can begin to make our plans for our ministry in 1989. I'm very, very pleased, very grateful for this response. You'll notice I have 2 glasses of water up here tonight. I'm still kind of hacking around with my throat. I'm better, I think, than I was last week, but if you see me sipping, I swear it's water, and I may need that to make it through this last lesson. I invite you to go with me to the place of peace and ask God's blessings on our gathering. Let us pray. Dear God, Father of each one of us, we thank you for your unending love, your love that does not end at death, but goes on and on. We thank you for your Son who entered our world, that we might eventually enter into the fullness of his experience. And we thank you for the Holy Spirit, the one who is present to remind us of all truth and to lead us finally into all joy. May the Holy Family, the mysterious Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, surround encompass and energize us this night. Into your hands we trustfully place ourselves with great hope through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. We've been thinking now for the last 10 weeks about that portion of the New Testament known as the Beatitudes. In the 5th, 6th, and 7th chapters of Matthew's Gospel, you have us find a compendium of what Jesus taught about his way in the kingdom as you find anywhere else. It's known as the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus begins the Sermon on the Mount by identifying 8 characteristics that are each one introduced by the word blessed, and I have been suggesting that taken together what we have here is Jesus' unique theory or philosophy of happiness. Here is what Jesus says is involved in each of us coming to that thing that we all most want when we're healthy, namely that we experience a genuine sense of fulfillment, genuine sense of peace. And I think that the 8 qualities that Jesus has suggested both correspond with some of the things that we've always thought, and at points may have challenged the way that we've been thinking on the subject. But I hope that after we've made our journey through these 8, that you will at least have things to think about as you're working with your own understanding, your own journey into the experience of joy. And I hope you'll also remember that I have tried to underline throughout this whole study that these are the gifts that God wants to give us. This is the wisdom of the Creator who knows what we're like, who understands how we're made. If you turn the Beatitudes into some kind of moralistic endeavor, as if here are the things that we have to achieve in order to get God to love us, I think you miss the essential structure of grace that I see to be basic to the Christian life. The 8 qualities that we've been talking about for these last weeks are things that God wants to give us, gifts that he wants to stir up and make available in our own living. And so I want you to think of this philosophy of happiness as simply Jesus' way of saying, here is what the Father's good pleasure is in your behalf. It's not his will that any of you should perish. It is his will that you come to the fullness of joy, and the joy that you'll be experiencing is a joy that will have this particular quality about it. And the 8 features that we have been identifying, I think, are the 8 basic essentials to what it means to be a happy human being in this kind of world. Now, it is really important to know that the part that you play in this is to open yourself to the giving of the gifts and to allow these gifts to grow. You don't have to earn these and then be rewarded. I've been deeply impressed, and I've quoted on other occasions a thing that happened to Thomas Merton when he was struggling as a young man to find his way to spiritual maturity. In his searching period, he had a friend say to him one day, you know, the only authentic vocation for a human being is to become a saint. And all you have to do to become one is to want to be one. When he first heard that, he thought that was an oversimplified poppycock. And he went to a man who was his spiritual advisor and said, do you know what Max said to me? And then repeated this dictum. The only authentic vocation for a human is to become a saint, and all you have to do to become one is to want to be one. And his old spiritual advisor said, of course. And it was the coming together of 2 witnesses that forged in his understanding that wanting to come into God's will is the part you and I have to play. 95% of the energies that get us anywhere come from the universe. About 5% are our own effort. So remember, as you're thinking about happiness, that this is God's gift. Also remember that he cannot inject it into you against your will. You've got to want to be joyful. You've got to be willing to receive the gifts of God. Now, technically speaking, there are only 8 Beatitudes. That is, there are 8 qualities that are prefaced by this term, blessed are. But in that portion of the Sermon on the Mount that we've been working with, Jesus closes the 8 qualities that he has identified with 2 other statements about what persons who are part of his kingdom are going to be like. And therefore I think that I'm at least on some good grounds in concluding our study tonight by saying that though these 2 qualities are not prefaced by the term blessed, they are organic, it seems to me, in terms of a full-blown vision of happiness. Last week I made the point, as we were working with the last of the Beatitudes, that our human happiness, though it involves pleasure, is really and truly something more than mere individual pleasure. In fact, those of you that were here may remember that as I talked about, blessed are you that are persecuted for righteousness, blessed are you when people speak falsely against you, revile you, slander you, do all kinds of evil against you, rejoice and be glad. That Jesus was really saying to us a very important point about the nature of happiness, and that is that it is something bigger than pleasure. If you make the pleasure principle the sole determinant of your life, you're going to miss out on the deeper dimensions of joy. Each of us is created to serve purposes that are longer and larger than our own individual lives. We are made to belong to things that are bigger than we are. Therefore, I suggested that the reason that there could be persecution and happiness in the same sentence is that when you realize that there are times that you have to sacrifice pleasure or sacrifice comfort in order to be the servant of some of these larger causes that really do need to be accomplished, that there is such a thing as the reality of the unpleasant good. There are times when, because we belong to things bigger, larger, and longer than we are, we sacrifice our momentary individual happiness in order to serve those purposes. It is possible for there to be a profound experience of satisfaction even though the pleasure principle has gotten violated. Okay, I'd like to suggest tonight that when Jesus is saying that we are to be the salt of the earth and that we are to be the light of the world, he's really enlarging on that same concept. He's saying, in effect, that if you really want to be a happy person in this world, here is how you're going to relate to the world that is outside you and beyond you. Here are 2 images that are taken from first century life. Everybody would have been familiar with them. Here are 2 images that Jesus uses to say, these are the ways that a genuinely happy person is going to relate to the larger than himself or the larger than herself. Salt was recognized as a very precious entity back in first century Palestine. It came into existence as the gift of the sun, evaporated the water of the sea, and left the residue of salt, which was glistening and white. And therefore salt was looked on as a symbol of purity. It was also looked on as something that was of great value to the human beings of that culture. And light, of course, as all of us know, and as we're going to talk about tonight, is a tremendous positive boon, particularly when you find yourself in the midst of darkness. All right, Jesus is saying that if we are going to fulfill our vocation as belonging to things larger and longer than we are, then 2 images are given to us as to how we are going to relate to the larger world. To be the salt of the earth, which has become a commonplace in our speaking. When you speak of people as being the salt of the earth, you're really saying something complimentary about them. And saying that we're to be, to the larger context, salt and light, he's really just simply enlarging on the fact that you're to think of your happiness in larger terms than simply your individual pleasure principle. This leads me then to take these 2 images that Jesus gives us and ask what are the functions that they serve and therefore how can we get some clues as to how we live out our happiness in relation to the larger world. The first two functions have to do with salt. One of the first things that this particular reality does is that it's a preservative. Salt, when applied to meat, keeps it from spoiling. Salt, when ground into particular kinds of food, is the agent that keeps it from going bad. So the first thing that a genuinely happy person is going to seek to do as he or she relates to the larger world is that you are going to try to be part of that agency that keeps the decay, the fragmentation, the going bad of society that can so easily happen. To be the salt of the earth means that you're trying to preserve and you're trying to be a genuine conservative in terms of keeping values that we presently have, keeping them from going bad or to losing their place in society. Plutarch, the Greek writer, had an interesting image. He said that salt was to meat what the soul was to the body. The soul animated the body. The salt was that entity that when it was put into something after it had been killed, kept it from turning into something very putrid. In a day before refrigeration, this particular function of salt was very, very fundamental. I'd like to translate this to mean that the first thing that Jesus is suggesting that we do as happy persons is that we really take seriously that we are to help preserve, conserve the best of the heritage of the past. Several years ago, when in the 60s, when so much radicality was happening, I was asked to give some lectures out on the West Coast. And one afternoon, when I was not working, the friend who had invited me took me into San Francisco and down to the Haight-Ashbury area, which was a concentration of the flower people and so much of the disruption that happened back in the 60s. And I was struck, as I met some people who were there, that nobody in that context used a last name at all. You'd meet somebody and they'd say, I'm John, I'm Jim, I'm Sally, I'm Tom. Nobody ever gave a last name. And when I commented to my friend about this, he said, that's deliberate. He said, these individuals don't feel like there's anything that is worth conserving. They don't feel there's anything in their heritage that has any value. They look on the past as totally bankrupt, as having nothing in it whatsoever that is worth carrying on. And therefore they never use a family name because they're simply trying to get away from everything that lies back there. He said in California, there is a sense of the present and a sense of the future. There is no sense of the past. I found myself really being very, very sad at that bad misunderstanding of what I think is our human reality. Now, to be sure, everything about the past is not good. Development is one of the laws of reality. And to be the kind of person that can only look back and can only revere the past is to be as far off as those young people were. But when you look back over your shoulder and don't see anything that is worth preserving, don't recognize any value back there that is worthy of living on into the future, then I think your eyesight is badly jaded. John Gardner said of that same awesome period in our social history that every institution in America back in the 60s was caught in the radical crossfire between uncritical lovers and unloving critics. On the one hand were the people who were saying, burn, baby, burn. There is nothing back there that is of worth. That is the unloving critics. It saw nothing but bad in our heritage. Over against the people who were uncritical lovers, who were saying, in effect, America, love it or leave it. If you don't like everything about it, then just get out altogether. And he pointed out that this crossfire is lethal for any kind of growing thing. If the only thing you get is either uncritical uncritical loving or unloving criticism, that's going to wither a developmental reality, whether that be a person or an institution or what. Okay, I hear in this the authentic call to discern in our past what is worth conserving, and then to be part of the agents that sift carefully and discerningly through that heritage and find those things that are increasingly worth carrying into the future, and then being part of doing that. If we have to reinvent the wheel in every generation, if we have to start all over, think of all the past achievements that we waste. So the first thing that I see in this challenge to me, if I want to be a happy person and relate to the larger than myself, is that I've got to be part of that which is genuinely and creatively conservative, really treasuring the things of the past that have a right to live on. The second thing that salt does is that it enhances the inherent flavor of any kind of food. Now, everybody's had the experience of taking something and tasting it, and because it doesn't have the additive of salt, it has a kind of flatness, a kind of insipidness that put a little salt in, and the inherent flavors that are there are enhanced and are brought out. And salt is the thing that gives the savor. Salt is the thing that gives the zest. Salt is the thing that takes the latent and the potential and brings it up to actuality. Translated into human qualities, I would say that one of our roles as Christians in society is to bring out that kind of dimension of taking what's there but is not visible, something that cannot be tasted, and to call that into higher vividness. One of our jobs is to add zest, is to add a sense of taste, a sense of sparkle to the life that we are part of. And as we bring out qualities that are latent, we really do add to the dimension of richness in society. Oliver Wendell Holmes said he might have been a Christian minister if all the ministers he'd grown up seeing as a child had not looked like undertakers. That is, if they hadn't been so drab and so out of touch. That is the opposite of being the salt of the earth. As Christians, we ought to take such astonished delight at the gift of life, and then call forth all of its nuances, that we ought to be part of the excited dimension of reality. We ought to be part of the people who really do add zest and humor and good flavor to life. People have asked me, as you can imagine, hundreds of times since 1985, why did you change from the Baptist Church and become an Episcopalian? And I've obviously given that a great deal of thought. I've given several different answers to it, but one of the answers is that back in the 60s, back in the throes of the Civil Rights Movement, I began to meet isolated clergy who were involved in this movement. And to the person, the Episcopal clergy that I found there were folks that were both capable of courage, but also had a playfulness. They also had a kind of zest and joy of life that, frankly, I did not find in my background and that I found very appealing. The man who is now the bishop of the central part of North Carolina is a man named Bob Estill. He and I wound up being very, very close in those days. He was the most playful adult that I'd ever seen up to that point. I mean, he could have a good time anywhere. There was a free child in him that was absolutely uninhibited. He could take delight in little things. He could make jokes of almost everything. I never knew a person who enjoyed life any more than he did. And yet on occasion I saw him exercise incredible courage. He'd been a roommate of the governor of Kentucky at that time, and the governor had appointed him the chairman of the Human Relations Commission for the state, never dreaming that he would do anything with it. Well, he took it, and really took it seriously, and began to try to be part of the answer back in that fragmented time. And I saw, at a press conference once, I saw the governor get up and make some very bland statements, and I saw Bob Estill stand to his feet and in that public arena, stand the governor down about what he had promised. Took enormous courage. It took all kind of risk to do that. Here is this joyful man who could also be a courageous man. Well, that was the beginning of my being intrigued about how does one get in touch with the kind of power to live life that way. I remember asking him about it one day, and he was obviously nonplussed about it. He was not the kind of person who talked about his spirituality a great deal. When I really pressed him, I was really interested that he said, if there is a secret to how I do life, it's the Eucharist. He said, I really feel that I go to God's altar, and there in the mystery of that interchange, the very life of God is infused in me, and then I can go out to love the world and celebrate it in all of its wonder, and if necessary, to die for it. Well, there was nothing in my heritage that was anywhere close to that. Nothing like a transfusion of energy that gave you ways to be and do that you didn't have otherwise. And I remember being very, very impressed. At that time, I was an earnest Baptist who had my pack on 24 hours a day. I don't think I ever quit trying, even when I was asleep. It was just always hard, earnest, trying to make it out of our own strength. And to hear this man say that there is an energy that comes not because you deserve it, but because you go there and receive it like medicine. That was the beginning of my finding my way toward this part of the church. Back in the 70s, a good friend of mine ran an ecumenical religious retreat, and he said to me one day, quite offhandedly, in my experience of working with hundreds of people, I think Episcopalians are the healthiest Christians around because they know how to enjoy life and accept their humanity, and they know how to laugh. And he didn't say that to get me to be anything, because he wasn't one. He just simply observed, all of which is to say, I think we have in our tradition, and if you've been in it all your life, you may not realize it. I think we have in our tradition a way to be the salt of the earth that is genuinely unique in the American Christian scene. We have a way, because we have access, as everyone does if they only knew it, to that transfusion of energy that is called the Eucharist. I was talking to a man the other day who has diabetes. Every morning he has to give himself a shot of insulin in order to make it through the day. He is not an Episcopalian. But he said to me on the phone, I have come to look on my daily injection as a Eucharistic sacramental act. I inject into my body what it doesn't have so that it can function normally, just as I perceive those of you who rightly understand the mystery of the table as that life of God mysteriously entering and animating our lives. To be the salt of the earth is to take the latent qualities that are present in life and to bring them up into actuality. It's to make life tasteful instead of insipid. And if you have not had access to salt and have had to eat a meal without it, you know how flat it can be, and you know what a difference a little salt can make in the same basic realities where it pulls out what's always there but cannot be tasted. So, to be salt is to be part of the conserving, the preserving of that which is genuinely good, and it's bringing out the nuances that are latent. The other two qualities grow out of this second image. If we are to be the light of the world as well as the salt of the earth, I take this to mean that each of us is called to try to illumine as best we can the places where we find ourselves. This means that Jesus' invitation that we be disciples is a lifelong invitation. You and I are supposed to be learning every day of our lives. We are supposed to make our stance toward life, constantly pushing back the parameters of ignorance, trying to make sense of what is nonsense, trying to find some kind of meaning and some kind of order in the midst of our lives. And therefore, to be the light of the world means that we try to bring the candle of what we know and what we have experienced into the dark places where we find ourselves, so that the confusion in which all of us live is lessened, and the clarity and the ability to walk with some kind of purposefulness is enhanced. Every one of you know what it's like to be in a dark room, even if you're familiar with it, and have to make your way without the benefit of that which illumines your sight. I went in the other night to a room in our house that I know quite well, turned off the light on one side, had to make my way in the dark across, and I ran to the coffee table and I bumped into a lamp. Not having the light, even though I knew that terrain, was a real disadvantage. The third thing that I want to call you to tonight as a happy person is that you yourself are to be constantly trying to learn all you can and not let life be wasted on you. You are to constantly feel you haven't arrived, but that you do want to know more and more about the nature of reality, and then be willing to share this with other people. This doesn't mean that you're a know-it-all who's always going up to people and pouring your stuff on them whether they ask it or not. It means that when you find yourself in the presence of people that are confused and people that really are bumping into edges because they don't know any better, and you've had an experience that you think pertains, that you're willing to be as generous with the truth that you have learned as was the truth generous when it gave itself to you. There are two things that you and I can give to other people that do not diminish us, but rather enhance us. The one is truth, and the other is love. When you tell somebody something that you know, you are none the lesser for it. In fact, it's been my experience that the more I offer my insights, usually the more those insights are enriched. The truth usually turns out to be between us, and I share something, and somebody responds and shares back, and lo and behold, in trying to be sharer and teacher, I find out that I have become learner. So to be generous with what you know, to be willing to let other people in on the secrets that you have discovered, that's part of what it means to illumine the world. It's part of what it means to simply share where you are, the things you've learned and the things you've experienced, that they might somehow make the confusion a little less, and to being able to act intentionally a little clearer. I heard once about a trailer truck that mistook the height of a railroad trestle, and this driver drove under the trestle, and the top of his truck hit the trestle, and the truck got stuck. Well, it was a bad impasse, and they had all kinds of traffic backing up. And they called the railroad people, and they were not willing to have the trestle torn up in order to get the truck through. The truck company came and said they weren't willing to have the top of the truck destroyed in order to get it through, and they were at a terrific impasse as to what to do. When a 10-year-old boy standing by said quite offhandedly, "If it were mine, I'd let the air out of the tires of the truck." And all of a sudden the expert said, "My soul, here is a truth that will work. Let the air out of the tires, and nothing has to be destroyed." Would that we were all that practical and that wise. Would that whenever I came onto an impasse, I knew exactly what to say. But the truth is, there are times that you know things or have experienced things that can illumine the confusion that some people around you are having. And I would encourage you tonight, as we've been thinking recently about generosity with our money, be generous with what you know. Be generous with that experience that is yours and yours alone. And when you find yourself face to face with folk that are genuinely confused and perplexed, if you have anything that might be light to their darkness, it will not diminish you one iota. Everybody you teach simply enlarges the circle of light, and it doesn't take a thing out of your pocket to share what you know with somebody else. I read once about a Scottish doctor who operated back in the days when doctors made house calls regularly, and he went one day in his horse and buggy, accompanied by his old dog, up in the Scottish Highlands to a house where a dear friend of his was critically ill. He went in and found his friend in the last stages of his grapple with life. And as the doctor sat, realizing that there was nothing really that he could do, his friend said to him, I'm really up against it, am I not? He said, you are. He said, I don't have long to live, do I? He said, it's best I know you don't. And then a look of sheer terror came on the face of the friend, and he raised up in bed and he said, Doctor, I'm scared to death about what lies ahead. I'm absolutely petrified at the thought of dying. Well, the doctor realized that this was a critical moment in the journey of this person, and he didn't know what to say. In fact, he found himself praying in that moment, oh God, give me something that will bring clarity and peace to this troubled heart. And about that time, his prayer was answered in a most unexpected way, because what he heard was his old dog scratching on the other side of the door. And the doctor said, do you hear that scratching noise? He said, that's the dog that goes with me everywhere. He said, he doesn't have the remotest idea what's on the other side of that door. He doesn't have any idea what this room is like. But he says he hears my voice. He knows I'm here, and he knows me, and therefore he wants to be with me. He trusts what he doesn't know because he knows that I'm here. And then he said, I think that's what it's like to die, friend. He said, I'll be honest, I don't know what the room is like, the next room to which all of us pass. He said, I don't know any more about that room than a fetus inside the womb knows anything about time and space. He said, I don't know exactly what it's like, but you know and I know that our Lord has promised to be with us always. And he said, lo, I go to prepare a place for you, and I'll come back, and I'll get you, and I'll go with you across that divide. He said, I don't know what it's like out there in death, but I know who's out there, and I know how he feels about us all, and that's enough. And it seemed to be exactly what the dying man needed. It wasn't a word that dispelled all the mystery, but it was a word that gave some hope and some clarity to a pressing question. It's the best answer faith can give, that we take what we have experienced and use it to faith our way into what we haven't yet experienced. He was generous with what he believed and with what he knew. It has never yet diminished anybody to share truth or to share love. The other thing that it means to be the light of the world, I think, is that somehow that same quality that helps us to see in the dark is also the bearer of warmth against the cold that can so easily become the enemy of our lives. I have mentioned in other sermons about the time that Wolfgang Goethe was dying, this last of the universal people. He supposedly knew more about more subjects than any man in the 19th century. He was an exquisite playwright, historian, scientist. He had mastered almost every academic discipline. And as he lay dying, his biographer said that he sat up bolt right up in bed and cried out, light, light, more light. It was the passion of his life to know and to push the parameters of ignorance further and further back. When someone was reading this deathbed scene in his biography years later, a philosopher named Unamuno, he allegedly said to his wife when he got to that scene, you know, for all his brilliance, Goethe was finally mistaken, because instead of crying light, light, more light, what he should have cried was warmth, warmth, more warmth. But then Unamuno said, we humans don't die of the darkness, we die of the cold. Well, I think Unamuno was wrong. I think we need light to the depths of our being, but he was also right that to believe that there is nothing out there that really values or cares for your life, to live in a kind of frozen no man's land where there is nothing that really regards you as having any significance. That is the thing that chills our hearts. The thing we fear the most is to be utterly alone and unwanted and uncared for. And one of the things that I think light suggests to us as a vocation is that we're to be warm centers as well as light givers. We are to somehow to convey to people that their lives matter to us, that what happens to them is a concern to our individual existence, to reach out in the cold and bring some warmth that lets them know that at least one person regards their existence as significant, and one person is going to be there with them and for them, no matter what. In our American culture, we are so given to wanting to solve problems, so intent on answering questions and curing diseases, that we may have lost sight of the fact that you can care for a person significantly, even when you cannot cure them, that you can mean something to a person even when you cannot solve all their problems. I worked for a year as a chaplain in a hospital, and that was the most surprising learning that came to me in that year, that there was a kind of power in mere presence. I can remember again and again going to dying patients and having to say to them, I am as helpless as a chaplain to know what to say or do as I sense you are as a patient. All I can do is acknowledge that I am powerless as you are powerless. But the one thing I can do is to lift the burden of loneliness off of you. Though I can't reach in and solve what is taking the life out of your body, I can be with you. I can say to you what happens to you makes a difference to me. I can simply sit here with you and for you. And I was amazed that there is a power in shared powerlessness. That even when there's nothing you can do for somebody, there is still something you can be for that person. And time in my life when I felt very cold and very isolated and very alone, the folk that have come to me and somehow said, what happens to you makes a difference to me. Your existence is valued. Then I find myself being warmed. I know what unamino means, that we do die of the cold. I don't think any of us could survive for long if there wasn't at least one person who cared about our existence. And we are put here to be coals of fire as well as candles of light to the brothers and sisters that are close about us. So it seems like to me that the four things that these two images call us to do as happy human beings is to think of ourselves as preservers, enhancers of flavor, to think of ourselves as illuminators of the confusion that is about us where we can, and then most of all to think of ourselves as bearing the warmth of God into the cold of somebody else's life, and somehow saying to that person, you matter. What happens to you makes a difference to me. If you've read these two scriptures, you know that Jesus couples both of the challenges with a warning. He says that when the salt has lost its savor, it is no longer of use, and therefore it has to be cast out and trod underfoot. He says that lights or lamps were not meant to be put under a bushel, but to be set on a candlestand where they can do their work. Now what he's saying here, I think, is that these two capacities that God has given each one of us, to be salt and to be light, if they're not used, they're going to be lost. Now how does salt lose its savor or its power to preserve and its power to enhance flavor? It loses it when it's never brought in contact with food. Whenever salt just sits by itself in isolation, it cannot do what salt was intended to do. So if you and I are going to be salt of the earth, we have got to get involved. The place for the salt is in the soup. The place where we can be what we're called to be is when we're close enough to touch and preserve, close enough to enhance possibilities. In first century life, fire was a rather rare and precious quality, so you would light a lamp off some neighbor's fire, and then you really didn't want it to blow out because there weren't matches in that day, so fire was hard to start. So what they would do when they would go to bed at night would be to take a kind of tea cozy. It's the closest thing I can think of. It was called a bushel, and they would put this over the one living fire that they had in the house to preserve it from being blown out. So every night they would put the lamp under the bushel, as they called it, put it on the mantelpiece, and to preserve it, the next morning they would take it off. Now that was a familiar routine for saving the fire. But if your only concern is to save your light, that is, if the truth you know and the warmth you have, you're so concerned to simply keep it to yourself. If you don't put it on the lampstand, that is, if you don't bring it in contact with people, then the light is going to be as if it were darkness at all. So here again, if the place for the salt is in the soup, the place for the light is up close to the darkness. The place for the warmth is in the midst of the coldness. And if we are not willing to use these powers, then you can just bet on the fact you're going to lose them. If I quit exercising my arm, I lose the capacity that it presently has. Everything that we choose not to use, we're going to eventually lose. And maybe the thing that causes so many of us to miss the mark of our lives is not that we're blatant and arrogant in our misuse of power. Maybe the greatest sin that most of us have is the sin of fear, the sin that says, I'm afraid to take a risk. I don't want to get too close to things for fear that my salt will be absorbed. Or I don't want to get too close to things that I find my light being put out. And so we don't risk the kind of involvement, and therefore our salt and light doesn't do what it has the capacity to do. If we don't use these gifts, we're going to lose them. I want to conclude our 10-week study by trying to gather up in one human figure the truths that I in the Beatitudes and tonight in these qualities of salt and light. The old saying, I'd rather see a sermon than to hear one any day, is the premise for this. I want to conclude this teaching by simply giving you a model, one human figure in which I sense the happiness that Jesus talked about coming into focus. And it's a person that I think illustrates for us the qualities of the Beatitudes and also what it means to be salt and it means to be light. His first name, the name that his parents gave to him, is the name Joseph. You may be surprised to hear that there are 16 different Josephs in the biblical record. The most famous was the Old Testament character that was sent down to Egypt by his brothers, the husband of Mary, the mother of our Lord, was also named Joseph. There's 16 different people in the biblical record that have the first name of Joseph. But you're going to know this man, if you know him at all, not by the name his parents gave to him, but by a nickname that the early church gave to him because of insights that they saw into his character. I've always been interested in nicknames because I think they tell us more about a person than maybe their given names. I knew a 60-year-old man once that was called Simp by everybody. Well, it turned out he'd been a slow learner in school. He had gotten tagged as a simpleton way back, and though he was 60 years old, Simp was the way that he was known to all his contemporaries. I knew a woman once named Pug, and if you'd ever seen her, you would have known why it was that she had been given that particular nickname because of this configuration in the middle of her face that had been there all her life. Nicknames usually pertain to things that people see in us. This individual who sums up what I'm trying to suggest, his nickname was Barnabas, which in the Hebrew means son of encouragement. The Hebrew language doesn't have any adjectives. If you were giving an adjective, you always made that person the son of something, and that was a daughter of beauty would have been a beautiful woman. The son of encouragement would have been, this is the man for whom this particular word was the best description. Son of encouragement meant this is a person who was known for his power to put life into folk who were struggling, who was known to have a sense of the future that was bigger than the sense of the past. Barnabas, the son of encouragement, I think models all the qualities that we've been talking about for these 10 weeks. He appears 3 times in the book of Acts, only 3 bit parts in the drama of biblical history. And yet each time he does something that will help you understand why he was recognized, not as simp, not as pug, but as Barnabas, the son of encouragement. The first time we see him, the little church in Jerusalem is struggling for its life. The Hebrews had killed Jesus, the Jews had killed Jesus because of his claim to be the Messiah. They thought they'd put an end to the Jesus phenomena forever, and then people began to say, he is risen, the crucified carpenter is no longer dead, and here they found themselves faced with an even stronger movement on their hands. And so they moved in on the believers with economic boycotts. They began to try to squeeze them out by taking their jobs away from them, taking away their money. And it looked like for a while that the church was just going to be strangled out of existence. Well, one of their members was this Joseph, surnamed Barnabas, who owned some property back in Cyprus. And in that moment when he saw the church really under terrific pressure, he sent word to Cyprus, sold that property, came and presented that gift to the leaders of the church and said, here, take this money and use it to help the people that are in the biggest trouble. He didn't put a lot of strings on it. He didn't say, I want to give it so that everybody will know that I gave it. He made his gift to the authorities of the church and said, I've got more than I need. Give this to the people that have less than they need. In other words, he saw in dispirited people something that he wanted to enhance. He wanted to preserve something that he felt like had a right to live on into the future. He saw a confused situation that he could clarify, a cold situation that he could warm. He gave this gift, and it had a chain reaction in the church. When people saw Barnabas pitting what he had and said there is a future to this little body of people, then other people began to go and sell what they had, and there was this golden moment that the book of Acts tells us when everybody had enough to get by, nobody was in need, and they lived with a kind of joy and a kind of enoughness that is rarely seen in a human community. He got his nickname because at a crucial moment in the life of the church, he was willing to be salt and he was willing to be light. The next time we see him, he's not taking a chance on the church, he's taking a chance on an individual. One of the persecutors of the church was a man named Saul of Tarsus, a fanatic, a person who was doing everything he could to stamp out the Christians. He had done his destructive work in Jerusalem. He got permission to go to Damascus to root out the Christians there. And on his way to Damascus, he ran head-on into the Christ that he was trying to destroy. He discovered to his dismay that his opponents were right and he was wrong. He met the risen Christ and discovered what the early Christians were talking about. He is blinded by this experience. He goes into Damascus in complete confusion. If you can envision a Super Bowl, and in the second quarter, the star quarterback for one side goes to the sidelines, takes off his uniform, severs all his ties with his teammates, and goes across the field and dons the uniform of the opponent and comes back on the field to be the quarterback for the other side. You get some sense of this incredible thing that happened. One day Saul was trying to kill the Christians in Damascus. The next day he's had this experience. and now he says he is a believer also. Well, now most of us humans just can't switch that quickly. We cannot adjust to that kind of radical change. There was enormous suspicion of this persecutor who now claimed he was a believer. Some people said, this is a trick. He's trying to infiltrate into our ranks to find out who we are, and then he's going to do his work of destruction. And so here was Saul, having had this radical experience where he had to change 180 degrees, like a newborn baby thrust into the world. And there for a while it didn't look like that there was going to be anybody that was going to believe in him enough to midwife him into some kind of strength. In that situation, when Saul of Tarsus had had his abrupt experience, and he's up here in Damascus not knowing what on earth to do next, Joseph, surnamed Barnabas, hears about it. He may have known Saul from his interactions in Jerusalem. He goes to Damascus. He investigates for himself what had happened. He maybe even talked to Saul. And then that good man, who had once laid his money on the line to save a little church, takes the new convert by the hand and uses his considerable influence to go back to Jerusalem and says, I believe that this is authentic. I believe that Christ has in fact spoken to this one. I believe he is a chosen vessel. There are latent qualities in this man that God can still use. He put his reputation on the line that the experience of Saul had been authentic. And we, the church, would not have had our finest missionary. We would never have the epistles that are part of our New Testament canon if it hadn't been for Joseph, surnamed Barnabas, going out on a limb on behalf of this convert that everybody suspected. There's been great speculation as to exactly how the conversion of Saul happened. Stephen's testimony as he was being stoned to death about asking for forgiveness. The man up in Jerusalem, in Damascus, Ananias, who went to him and laid hands on him and called him brother. Both of those were significant, but if it hadn't been for the son of encouragement, this one who drew out the latent qualities that were in this man, if it hadn't been for Barnabas, we never would have had Paul the Apostle. The last time we see him, he is by this time several years older, when they heard in Jerusalem that the Antioch Christians were growing into a faith. They sent Barnabas up there to see what he would think of this new community. And he went up and he found them to be vibrant. He found them to be alive. And he remembered this man whose career he had rescued, who had gone back to Damascus to study. He went and got Paul, brought Paul down to Antioch. Paul became the great teacher of that fellowship. It was from that church that Paul and Barnabas went on the first famous missionary journey. They became a tremendous duo. They went all around what is now the beginnings of Macedonia and on into Europe. And then they came back. And they were getting ready to take a second missionary journey, and they were deciding who was going to go with them. And there'd been a young man named John Mark who had gone with them the first time, and the going got rough, and he turned back. And Barnabas says to Paul, you know, I've talked to John Mark. He's sorry for what he did. He's got better stuff in him than his quitter performance shows. I think we ought to give him another chance and take him with us a second time. Now the irony is that Paul, who was given a second chance by the grace of the church, was unwilling to do the same thing for John Mark. You see, we're not converted overnight. We are slowly sanctified. Those of us who have been forgiven, it sometimes takes a long time for us to become forgiving people. But what I'm saying is that Barnabas saw in John Mark the kind of qualities that he had seen in Saul, and he was willing to take a chance on him. And when Paul was unwilling to take John Mark, Barnabas said, okay, I'll take him. We'll go on our own missionary journey. And Barnabas disappears off the pages of the New Testament. He took John Mark, and Paul took Silas with him. The interesting thing is that years later, Paul is now aged, he's in jail, he's really at the end of his life. He writes to Timothy and he says, bring me John Mark because he's useful to me. Would John Mark have grown into the person he did if Paul's kind of idealism had been the only influence? No. It was the son of encouragement who knew how to bring light into confusion, who knew how to bring the mercy of warmth into coldness. It was his taking a chance on John Mark that finally enabled him to become what he did. So as a conclusion of this study, I would simply like to say that one of the great responses that you and I could make to having lived our way through the Beatitudes would be if we could start, just informally among ourselves, a new order here at St. Luke's. I propose that we call it the Order of St. Barnabas. All you have to do to belong is to decide that you want to be a source of encouragement to other people, that you want to be salt and you want to be light to their particular situations, that you want to sense where there are people that have lost heart, somehow move alongside and do for them what Barnabas did, that you want to sense people in whom there are latent qualities, but you need some salt to bring it out to its full taste. The Order of St. Barnabas would be the embodiment of the Beatitudes that we have been studying, and it would be what this world so sorely needs. I'll be honest with you. I could use encouragement from time to time. I could use some of you sensing where I have needs. I could use some injection of heart, as surely as I want to be that to some of you as God gives me the strength to do it. I don't see anybody in this room that couldn't profit from some encouragement. And I don't see anybody that can't be an encourager. Therefore, as a kind of climactic act of our working with the qualities of happiness, our thinking about salt, our thinking about light, and then our seeing in the face of the Son of Encouragement a vision of what each one of us could be, I invite you